Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Anish Vijay from Chainlink Labs, and I'm happy to be here today to moderate this panel on automation infrastructure and the use cases of Chainlink Keepers. We have an excellent group of panelists here to talk about reliable automation, how automation is evolving as the blockchain ecosystem grows and becomes more sophisticated, and where Chainlink Keepers fits into this picture. Smart contracts allow for a highly trustworthy collaboration across even distrusting parties, establishing and maintaining a truth that we can all agree to. But there are limitations. They cannot communicate with the outside world on their own, a problem that's addressed through decentralized Oracle networks, and they require external input for actions to be taken, oftentimes cascading down from a user clicking a button somewhere on a UI. However, not all actions can be driven by immediate end user input, so we need to create these off-chain application layers and infrastructure layers to set on top of your smart contracts, so your dApps can be automated based on time, events, some combination of the two, perhaps some off-chain computation, rather than being solely driven by direct human interaction. Now, creating and maintaining this automation infrastructure is critical to the core function of many dApps. And today we will discuss the pitfalls and the opportunities that automation infrastructure presents and how to safely and reliably outsource this fundamental automation work. On our panel today, we have Kane Warwick, the founder of Synthetix, Max Figa from the core team at Barnbridge, Ernesto Boado, the CTO of Aave, Brendan Asselstein, the CTO of PullTogether, and Peter Van Morik, the CEO of Chainlayer. We have a lot to get through today, so I'll just jump right into it. As a starting point, it might be useful for the audience to hear a bit about your project and the role of automation in your work. Kane, would you like to kick us off with this?
Sure. For those of you who don't know, Synthetix allows you to get exposure to a range of different assets on Ethereum. It's a fairly complex smart contract suite, and we were lucky to work with Chainlink early to implement their oracles to support the network. But over the intervening 2 years, I think it's been now since we've been live, we've added a lot of new functionality, and there's a lot of aspects of the system that require intervention. And so we have a number of aspects of the protocol that, on a weekly basis, some bot or some keeper needs to come in and make a transaction based on some information that's on the blockchain, and it's just not possible to kind of automate those things with simple payments. So we've been talking to Chainlink about taking over a lot of that infrastructure as they do with our oracles, because we want a streamlined and simple interface for all of these different aspects of the system that need to be maintained.
Awesome, thank you for that, Kane. Ernesto, would you like to cover Aave?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know what Aave is a liquidity protocol where people can supply assets to get yield on them or borrow them. And in general, it's a pretty a standalone running protocol, let's say, in the sense that it doesn't need so much automation, at least in multiple points. But there are certain aspects, like, for example, the liquidations where actually automation can improve the system by orders of magnitude. So another point is also like in certain parts where the computation are quite heavy, and potentially it could be re-architected to introduce other parties that do some kind of automation to optimize the cost. So yeah, pretty excited to see how is going to look the ecosystem like in the future with intervention of keepers.
Perfect. Thank you, Ernesto. Peter?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, Chainlayer is a node operator on the Chainlink network. We're also a staking service provider on a lot of networks. And I think Keeper for us enables us to do a whole lot of automation on things we now run in various crowns, various systems, and especially the security aspect of it is amazing. If you run a script that has to do something on chain, you basically need a private key somewhere, or you need to secure it with ledgers or difficult things. And with Keeper, that whole part of security is basically outsourced to the node operators. We like to dog food Chainlink as node operators, and this is a perfect example of things we can do ourselves. So yeah, really excited.
Thank you, Peter. Brendan, would you like to go next?
Yeah. Thanks, Anush. So I'm Brendan from Pool Together, and Pool Together is a prize savings game. So users deposit into a prize pool, interest accrues, and that interest is awarded as a prize. And so the prizes are awarded periodically. We use Chainlink for two things. One, the Chainlink VRF to get a random number to select the winner or multiple winners. And two, we need that reward triggered periodically. And in fact, it can be triggered by anyone, but as Peter said, we effectively need a cron job to run it. But what we can do now is have the protocol cover the cost of rewarding the transactions, because of course that needs to be paid for, and have it managed all by the Chainlink keepers. So it's a really effective system for us to be able to outsource that, which we try to do as much as possible. We don't want to run servers.
Understandable. Max, would you like to go next?
Sure. So Barnbridge is a risk tokenization protocol, meaning that we build applications that go after specific risks users in DeFi are trying to alleviate or get more exposure to. We rely on Chainlink keepers primarily for our smart exposure application, which allows anyone to create a pool between any two assets, any ratio they'd like, that will constantly rebalance kind of around the parameters of that pool. So that might be 5% deviation from the ratio between the two assets on a daily basis. And when that deviation is triggered, a Chainlink keeper can actually trigger the swap necessary to bring things back to parity with the kind of established ratio of a given pool.
Thank you, Max. So thank you all for introducing your company and how you're using Chainlink, as well as where you might see automation having an impact on your work. I think it'll be good for us to maybe dig a little bit deeper into how what considerations really go into the process of deciding how you do automation. The criticality of automation is clear in order to create more and more sophisticated dApps over time. But there are a number of difficult to consider. There's DevOps maintenance concerns. There are centralized automation risks. There's economic incentive considerations. And maximizing decentralization is also critical as part of this. Perhaps you could share what are some of the complexities that you've found in your experience, and perhaps some pain points as well. I'd like to open this up to the entire panel and see where we go from there.
Well, I'm happy to start.
Excellent,
yeah.
Thank you.
I can kick it off. Yeah, So we've been using Chainlink VRF now for a good while now. In fact, probably over a year and a half or so. And an important consideration has been support, has been the ability to reach out to somebody if something goes wrong to get things in order again. And so that was a big consideration when looking at Chainlink keepers, is that there's accountability. And it's difficult to have that in all decentralized systems. I mean, if something happens on Ropsten, who do you talk to? Who do you reach out to? Do you just tweet it out and hope for the best, and see if someone picks it up? So that accountability is really important. And just because, in these kind of external systems, like, Oracle networks, essentially, if we include keepers as part of that kind of, then things are going to go wrong. There are going to be problems. It's inevitable. And so having a support system has been really, really valuable to us. So that's been the primary consideration. Secondary, as I already mentioned, we don't want to run servers. Our goal is to become a pure decentralized protocol. So we want to stick to our core value add, which is writing great smart contracts. And so being able to delegate that for a pretty minimal premium is really valuable to us. We want to make sure that it's done well by a professional community.
Thank you, Brendan. Kane, I think Synthetix has some very interesting scenarios to consider here. So yes, please.
Yeah, I think one thing I will say, if you're on Ropsten in 2021, you're probably NGMI, unfortunately. Sorry, Ropsten Maxis, but I think it's game over there. So I think with Synthetix, we've got a range of different things, right? And a range of considerations in terms of like incentivization, economic incentives. There's a whole range of considerations that we had. And what we ended up with over the course of multiple years was like this patchwork of different systems with different incentives, and they were incompatible, and sometimes things wouldn't work, and actions wouldn't be triggered, and it was just a bit of a mess. And so we actually started working originally with Andre when he started developing Keeper, and we talked to him. But I think one of the primary considerations that was kind of not met for me, at least in that architecture, was this idea of taking the kind of auction process offline. So having some kind of mechanism to ensure that you weren't having these gas wars. Because we saw this a lot in the early days when we had Keepers, even for simple things like closing a fee period. It got to a point where there were multiple different bots that were competing for it. And then over time, all of the less successful bots just dropped off to the point where there was only one, and then that one would fall over and then nothing would happen. And so we saw this play out. We saw this, kind of iterative game play out where like one person would take all of the spoils, and then eventually, something would go wrong and there was no decentralization, and it didn't work. And so it was really important to us that the architecture that we chose had this, component of some kind of off-chain system to ensure that you didn't have perverse economic incentives. So when Chainlink started working with Andre and all of this research started happening, and we started talking to you guys and going a bit deeper, that to me was like the primary consideration, that this was like this off-chain network. The economic incentives were aligned. You had confidence that you weren't going to have this winner-take-all effect, and then a very brittle system emerging over time. So you could kind of implement it and not worry about it, and go away and assume that it was still going to be there in 6 months' time, and not be constantly monitoring to see what the state of it was.
Right. It's kind of the situation where it's game theory 101. You need to make sure that there's cooperation between all the keepers so that everyone is profitable in general, and not have just a Wild West competition between all the different parties involved. Thank you for that, Kane. Max or Nessa, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I can take that. I think what I find more interesting is like the implications that it has in architecture of new systems. Like personally, I suppose everybody else that has experience on smart contracts in the call like knows that when you have a system that is too reliable on parties that needs to trigger something, usually the system, initially at least, seems a bit more fragile, because you need to have a good system of incentivization, you need to have good infra, because usually you need to check some conditions of chain to then trigger that action on chain. So we just try to avoid it as much as possible. But obviously, in a lot of cases, it's not possible to avoid it. So having something like Keeper, and we already also experimented with Andre back in the days for the liquidations, on the previous system of Keeper, but having a system that is reliable in terms of infra and incentives, and systems like the Aave protocol that is basically running out there and centralized doesn't really need to care that works well. I think it's a huge advantage even for future design of systems, where you can actually think, okay, maybe it's fine to have some scheduled tasks on the design, because at least there is a reliable system out there that could cover them. So.
Right. Those are definitely some of the themes we've consistently seen when doing some of the user research on what are our users looking for from an automation infrastructure. But reliability is always coming up as like the number one in general. And that is represented in a number of different ways. And then the second thing we've been hearing a lot about is around ease of use. And a third and very critical component that we've seen from a segment of the marketplace seems to be around being able to do some of this computation off-chain, so that you don't have as much excess gas costs. If doing everything on chain is extremely expensive, reads are expensive over time. And so that's come up quite a bit in our discussions as well. Max, do you have any thoughts as to like how off-chain computation as part of a infrastructure model to trigger actions might benefit BarnBridge?
Sure. So when you think about the types of assumptions we make in DeFi today around risk management, right? It can be, you have to take into consideration what you can do on chain, and that's quite limited. Whereas, when we look at incumbents in legacy finance, they're, running risk algorithms day and night to manage their systems, right? And so when we think about where does DeFi head over the next 2-3 years, I think off-chain computation, kind of referencing back to smart contracts and being able to impact the parameters we're operating under in those smart contracts is going to be very critical. And something I'd add just kind of on the last question line, right? Along with that expansion of DeFi and this expansion of complexity, I think there's definitely something to be said for specialized services like Keeper Networks, right? Because if you imagine a new project launching today, maybe they're DAO first, maybe they're not, but it's going to become increasingly difficult to consider all of these other chains that might be a constellation around Ethereum. And how do you accommodate your apps across multiple ones, right? Do you have your own bots on every single network that may or may not be relevant to your apps, right? And so this idea that like having a Keeper network allows you as a new team to kind of have this infrastructure kind of, again, in your sails, so to speak, as you're examining the wider landscape, I think is also really critical.
Agreed. And Peter, from Chainlayer's perspective, you guys are involved in being a fundamental infrastructure to the blockchain ecosystem. And I'm kind of curious, like from your perspective, how do you see long-term where automation can really help perhaps reduce some of the burden on your teams?
I think on our side, there's a lot of things we need to do on networks, like redelegate rewards, withdraw commissions, maybe even activate validators in some cases. And basically with Keeper, you can automate any on-chain thing, and especially with CCIP just being announced. For us, this I mean, this basically
lots of things coming together.
Yeah, this really opens endless opportunities for us to automate not just the infrastructure, because unfortunately we do need infrastructure to run our organization. And we like to automate infrastructure as much as possible, but the on-chain part is always something that's really hard to automate. To be honest, today I'm not really sure where we're going to end up in a year, but yeah, the possibilities are endless, basically. But I think we're really excited about facilitating other users with their goals. I think for us as an infrastructure company, we live because other people rely on our expertise regarding security and keeping things up. And this is just another perfect example of an opportunity where we as Chainlayer, and I think all node operators, are really going to be excited to be a part of automating more things on the side of our customers.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, and that kind of brings us to a future-looking concern. And obviously, it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen, but blockchain is often seen as this democratizing foundation for the world to form trusted bonds without having to place the trust purely in brands, individual promises, or relying on institutions for adjudication purposes. So I'm personally very curious about how the ecosystem reacts to having an incredibly easy to integrate automation infrastructure at their fingertips. What will emerge next? If we look at how the ecosystem has been evolving over time, we've seen changes at an astounding rate. What DeFi is today was a dream 2 years ago, and that was broadly enabled by obtaining high-quality price and market data on-chain. So in a more future-looking perspective, what do you see as the potential changes we'll see as the ecosystem matures and automation infrastructure becomes a lot more easily accessible, so any dApp developer can make use of it in a matter of minutes? Brendan, would you like to jump on this one, or Ernesto?
Sure. Yeah, I can jump in. It's a very broad question.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I do want to make a quick comment, though, because your last question was a really good one, in that we have direct, and the question was, how useful will it be to move that computation off chain? And with the current Keeper design, you do first the check to see what needs to be done, and then the work, the actual transaction. Our code for those two are almost identical. And the check can be done entirely off chain because it is the actual execution that does the verification of what, it only can run a valid transaction. And so moving that off chain will be super critical. And we've been doing that more and more. In fact, Pool Together V4, we're moving a lot of computation off chain. So it just becomes verification in that sense. So I do see a lot of potential for growth there. in terms of unlocking developer capabilities, I mean, the more these pieces become Lego pieces, the more innovation we're going to see at hackathons and elsewhere. The more permissionless this is to get involved. You know, if registering a keeper becomes as simple as just like pushing a button, we're going to see some awesome innovation happen at these hackathons. That's where Pool Together started. That's where a lot of projects get started. When you bring people together and just give them the tools to be able to build whatever they want to build. So as this system becomes more permissionless, I think innovation will only grow exponentially.
Agreed.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Brendan on both points. Like moving off-chain computation is completely necessary. Like we are seeing it now with 4x4, like the gas consumption of the smart contracts that are deployed, like it tends to go up all the time. So it's important that new tools appear that they offload that. And then that unlocking the developers is, I think, is where I'm more bullish on this kind of systems, because end of the day, even if in Ethereum sometimes like the constraints on development is actually what brings a bit of innovation, I don't think it's really optimal. So probably that is the solution, like having at least a minimal assumption that you could automate something on chain or with this hybrid system. Also, I would say that the bridging capabilities and like playing with cross-chain communication with these keepers is something which I'm pretty bullish on. So, but probably it will be a bit more in the line. So,
absolutely. I mean, connecting all these different tooling together to create a more sophisticated hybrid DApp, hybrid smart contracts, is definitely the future. Kane, would you have anything to add to that?
I think Ernesto's point earlier was pretty indicative of kind of the place that we're at, right? You know, a few questions ago, he kind of made the point that like, oh, we try and avoid this as much as possible, right? Like we try not to have any automation. That's kind of the default assumption for people, you know, at the moment. It's like anything that, you know, even looks like it requires a keeper or whatever, like let's work out a system that might be more complex or convoluted that can avoid that. And so I think that once we get to a level of comfort in the ecosystem that this is a thing and it works and it's stable, it's the same thing as, you know, like I see keepers as kind of like a subset of the Oracle problem, right? Like it's just a specific, you know, implementation of the Oracle problem. And I think when we saw Chainlink oracles get to a point where the DeFi ecosystem was comfortable using them, and remember that always wasn't the case, right? Like, you know, a lot of people were running their own oracles. The effort of running your own oracles or your own keepers is significant. And so you couldn't just turn up at a hackathon and be like, oh, let me just spin up my own oracle today, and then that will allow me to do whatever I want to do in this hackathon, right? So like these are really enabling technologies. And I think that we're probably not there yet in terms of like getting everyone a level of comfort that, you know, these are ready for production, but I think it's close. And once it gets to that point, then, you know, it sort of goes parabolic.
Definitely. It does feel like we're very much at that starting point of getting the kind of tooling necessary for developers to really be able to create highly sophisticated apps with just one or two people in a garage. As Brendan was saying, a lot of these projects start off from a small group getting together to make something very interesting. So we have DeFi now. We have a whole bunch of new business verticals that can start being enabled by blockchain technology. And having these small groups come together to really create this next generation is, I think, where we're hopefully going to see a lot more of the market go. Max, is there anything you wanted to add to that from a BarnBridge's perspective?
No, I think everything was covered quite well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So that's pretty close to about the amount of time we have for this panel. So I'd like to close out by thanking all the panelists for being here today. And for those of you watching online, our goal in creating Chainlink Keepers was to provide this easy-to-use, reliable automation infrastructure for the blockchain ecosystem and the developer community at large. Any dApp developer looking to automate their smart contract can integrate Chainlink Keepers without worrying about deep integration concerns, and can do so in a matter of minutes to hours. Making your contracts keeper compatible, all it requires is your Solidity code and a simple registration process with our Chainlink Keepers app. Chainlink Keepers Network is created to create a fundamental fair playing field where keepers must cooperate with one another and not compete. Head over to our website, read our latest blog post, and check out our documentation. We are now live on mainnet, and we'd love to have you using their product. I hope this was engaging and informative, and I hope you enjoy the rest of SmartCon. Thank you.
Thanks, Anush.
Thanks, Anush.
Thank you, everyone, to the whole panel. And Anush, I hope you guys enjoyed meeting Anush as well, Chainlink Labs team member. I really appreciate you guys' insights there.